Welcome everyone to the annual public lecture of the Local Governance Research Centre. My name is Stephen Griggs. As it's just the banner's just come up to explain, I'm director of the LGRC, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone tonight for this annual public lecture. The work of the LGRC investigates place stewardship, centre local relations, local democracy, voice and accountability, local workforce, collaboration and innovation across a whole number of fields, including housing, health, environment, transport. So what we hope to do in the LGRC is bring together a whole independent and robust voice of policy relevant research for local government. And we bring together, in doing so, over 20 researchers from different disciplines. Part of our underlying engagement is an ethos of engaged research. And I'm very delighted tonight to see so many people come together for this lecture. So many people from across different areas of local government and across the community of local government and those different voices. Tonight's lecture will be given by Dr Patrick Diamon from Queen Mary University, University of London. His focus will be English localism over the last 20 years. But I'm going to leave it to Arianna Giovannini, the Deputy Director of the LGRC, to introduce Patrick. I just simply want to say thank you to Arianna for her work in bringing this event together, and to the events team who've done the work behind the scenes supporting us to deliver this lecture online. And of course, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick, for agreeing to deliver this annual lecture. And now over to Arianna to introduce Patrick and to start the debate.
Thanks very much, Steve, and good evening, everyone. My name is Arianna Giovannini, and I am the Deputy Director of the Local Governance Research Centre. Like Steve, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you all to the LGRC annual lecture, and it's a real honor to have Dr. Patrick Diamon to deliver the lecture this year. Patrick needs very little introduction because many of you in the audience, I'm sure, know already him and his work. But just quickly, Patrick is a reader in public policy at Queen Mary University of London, and he was formerly a research fellow in the Department of Politics at the University of Manchester and fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. And he is a visiting fellow at the Kellogg College, University of Oxford, and an associate member of Nuffield College. Before joining academia, Patrick was also chair of the think tank Policy Network, and he sits on the scientific council of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. But even before that, he also held a number of senior posts in British central government between 2000 and 2010, and was head of policy planning in number 10 Downing Street. And Patrick was also a councillor in the London Borough of Southwark between 2010 and 2014. So Patrick is certainly someone who brings in a wealth of expertise, not just from an academic perspective, but also from the world of practice, from the very local level to being working in a very important role within central government. And today in the lecture, Patrick is going to look at English localism over the past 20 years, assessing the growing gap between promises and performance. In many respects, the starting point of the lecture, or the reason why we decided to focus on this issue for this year's LGRC annual lecture, is because, of course, it's now 10 years since the Localism Act was published. And so we really wanted to take this as an opportunity to critically reflect on the challenges and opportunities of localism, and more broadly on the future of local government. If we look back at recent decades, we can certainly say that localism is one of those policy concepts that keeps reoccurring, often as a form, often presented as a sort of a panacea to address some of the most pressing issues in the governance of our country. Most recently, we've seen this, for example, in the Levelling Up agenda. We've seen yet another revival of the idea of re-empowering local places. But how do we do that in practice? And why is this a theme that continues to reoccur, but we never quite managed to do it right? So this is another very important aspect to keep in mind when we look at localism is that very often the burden of doing or delivering localism has often been placed on local governments alone. And these processes have often kind of pointed towards the lack of capacity or ability of the local level as an obstacle to a viable form of localism. But is this the full story? First of all, is local government really, where the problem is in terms of capacity and ability to deliver? But perhaps even more importantly, this is now the time to think about also what is the role of central government too into this process, and what are the obstacles that within local central government itself in making localism happen. For example, this is something that has emerged very, very clearly from the findings in the final report of the APSI 2030 Local Government Commission that we at the LGRC were very proud to support with our research. And really those findings showed that, yes, we need to think about what needs to happen within local government, but we also need to think much more carefully about what is the role of the centre. And this is exactly where Patrick's lecture is going to take us. Patrick is going to assess how and why the relative weakness of the centre is an obstacle to localism. And so this is going to be a fascinating discussion for sure. With that, I think that's enough by means of an introduction, and I think I'll pass it over to Patrick now. So thanks very much, Patrick, for being with us.
Well, my pleasure, Ariana, and thanks so much to you and Steve for the very kind introduction. It's great to be with you all this evening and to have an opportunity to share some of these ideas. I'm going to, in this lecture, talk about the key theme of English localism, the widening gap between promise and performance. And what I want to really try to explain in this lecture is why it's the case that despite successive governments attempting to promote policies to advance localism, in many ways, so little has been achieved. And the expectations a decade ago of the rebirth of localism or the creation of a new localism don't really seem to have come to fruition. How do we explain this? How do we explain this glaring gap between promise and performance? That's what I'm going to explore in the lecture, and it's my main theme this evening. What I'm going to do is just begin by setting out the core argument of the lecture. I'm then going to move on to talk about what I call the dysfunctional centre, which focuses on the systemic weaknesses in the policy-making process which affect local centre relations in England. And I'm then going to conclude the lecture, perhaps more positively, by discussing some of the ways in which I believe it might be possible to reform the whole system of government in order to improve outcomes for citizens and for communities. So that's the focus this evening, and I just want to reiterate my thanks to the Centre at De Montfort for inviting me. It really is a privilege and an honour to give this lecture. Okay, so just to start then, the core argument. What I'm going to argue in this lecture throughout is that the case for English localism, it is conventionally believed, would be strengthened by the apparent ineffectiveness of central government. If we want a more active, a more assertive, a more effective localism, then surely the way to achieve that, in a sense, is to highlight the ineffectiveness and the weaknesses of central government. My argument, though, to challenge that view is that, in fact, localism is not necessarily advanced by having a centre of government which is ineffective, non-strategic, lacking crucial capacities, unable to act as an effective partner. On the contrary, I argue, in order to have a flourishing localism in England, we need a strategic, capable centre of government. And just to advance this argument, it's very striking that in responses to COVID-19, when we look at evidence from around the world, the best performing countries appear to be those that have functional, effective, multi-level governance systems. Those systems of policymaking and local centre relations are neither radically decentralised nor heavily centralised. They strike an effective balance in terms of the need for multi-level governance working. And my colleague Martin Laffin at Queen Mary and some other colleagues are, I think, shortly due to publish with Local Government Studies a special issue which looks at this and draws out some of the evidence about the countries that have done best. As I say, the countries that seem to perform best in dealing with COVID are those that have strong multi-level governance systems where there is a strategic centre, but also an empowered local tier. And that's a point I'll come back to later in the lecture. Just to then develop and clarify the rest of the argument, I'm going to also suggest in the lecture that the power-hoarding centralist mentality of Whitehall is not so much a reflection of a position of strength, but on the contrary, it reflects the position of weakness that so much of Whitehall and central government is now in. I argue that Whitehall and many of the key institutions of central government across the UK, but particularly affecting England, are suffering from a long-term crisis of purpose. And this increases in some ways their power-hoarding mentality, but it's from, as I say, a position of weakness rather than strength. I also argue that the major parties, both Labour and the Conservatives, have in many ways failed in the last 20 years to set out what I would determine as an intellectually coherent, cogent account of localism and local centre relations. They have, in different ways, proposed different localist projects, but in many respects, I argue, they failed to engage with the underlying tensions, the trade-offs, the potential contradictions that any localist project involves. And so I'm going to conclude, as I say, by discussing the ways in which we can breathe new life into a localist project in England by transforming the whole of our system of government. Let me just begin by establishing a few cursory definitions, because, of course, we have to acknowledge that the very term localism involves a great deal of ambiguity. I would indeed suggest that one of the reasons why ambiguity has been so localism has been so attractive to the political class is precisely because of its ambiguity. We're able to project in many ways what we like onto localism. Localism serves so many political purposes. It helps political parties to establish their credentials in terms of citizen engagement, reforming public services, and so on. But the very ambiguity of localism means we have to pay attention to its underlying and hidden meaning. Who is empowered when we undertake greater localism? Is it individual citizens? Is it about empowering communities? Or is it about trying to strengthen the capability of local councils to act effectively for their local communities and neighbourhoods? The coalition government that came to power and, of course, introduced the legislation, the Localism Act in 2011, which Ariana referred to in the introduction, in many ways was focused on a localist project that was about shifting power from central government to communities. And the role of local government in that story was either downplayed or not very satisfactorily clarified. And that is, I think, a major weakness in the localist project and the legislation that was brought forward. I'll make some more points about that a bit later in the lecture. I would also argue that any community empowerment that localism involves also requires strong, effective local government. If you're going to empower communities, you're going to give life to civil society, you're going to enable community organisations to flourish, you need strong forms of local government able to support that process. Also, what do we mean by localism? Is localism merely a form of administrative decentralisation where we pass down predefined responsibilities to the local level? Or is it a much more active form of governance where we enable local bodies to exercise real control on behalf of communities? How does the English localist project also relate to devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? This is a really important question. I will not do justice to it in this lecture, but I may refer to it in the conclusion. It's a very important question about the shape of devolution across the UK. It's also important, and I mentioned already, the failure to establish an intellectually coherent localist project among the major political parties in the UK. It's absolutely crucial to accept and to face up to the inherent conflicts and trade-offs that are involved in any localist project. And I'm not going to go through the list here. The issues, I think, will be familiar to many of the audience. In many ways, the classic trade-off in localism is between universal standards, national standards that are enforced from the centre, against devolution, diversity, and the emergence of so-called postcode lotteries that localism may entail. But there are other trade-offs between participatory governance and representative governance, between supporting places as against supporting certain individuals and designated groups. And there are also tensions around accountability and how we create accountability through localism. My point here is not that there are any easy answers to these questions, but that a really credible localist project requires us to face up to these inevitable conflicts and trade-offs. Okay, so I want to come now to the main focus of my lecture, which is the Dysfunctional Centre, the impact that it has on local centre relations in England, and the way in which, in my view, it has undermined the development of an effective and flourishing localism. And I want to depict this dysfunctional centre by referring to three developments which began over the last 20 years but have very much accelerated over the last decade. These are the transformation of the civil service culture in Whitehall, the breaking apart of the traditional bureaucratic monopoly over policy making, and thirdly, the centralisation of power in the core executive. Just to say a brief word about each of these, the transformation of the civil service culture in essence refers to the way in which civil servants have been made much more subservient to ministers. In my judgment, across Whitehall, the central imperative for many ministers has been to try to make the civil service more of a supplicant to the wishes of ministers in the policy-making process, to make the civil service more passive and also more enthusiastic in its support for government initiatives. It has done this through measures such as increasing personalisation in the appointments process for senior civil service roles. The churn of permanent secretaries has really accelerated in the last decade as a symbol of this transformation of the civil service culture. And other reforms have been introduced as well, including, of course, major cuts in the administrative capacity of some parts of the civil service. I argue that what all of these changes have been intended to do is to transform the civil service, to make the civil service more compliant with what ministers and politicians want. The second changes have been about breaking apart the bureaucratic monopoly over policymaking. And here again, we see efforts by ministers, not just to make civil servants more compliant with ministers, but also to make ministers less dependent on the civil service by drawing on new sources of policy advice from outside the government system, drawing on the work of think tanks, independent research institutes, management consultants. The growth of advice provided by management consultants has been a much underappreciated development in the last decade, but it's been very significant. And we can see this in the increasing expenditure on management consultancy. But there are lots of other examples as well of the ways in which ministers have tried to make themselves less reliant on the traditional bureaucratic infrastructure in the civil service. The third set of changes are about centralising power in the core executive, and here we see efforts by successive prime ministers to institutionalise power at the centre. It's very common for prime ministers to come to office declaring that they will be the prime minister who will shrink the capacity of Downing Street in order to allow cabinet government to flourish. But on the contrary, in so many cases, we see prime ministers who come to power despite these commitments, who then significantly increase the institutional capability of the centre. They increase the role of policy units, delivery units, strategy units. They use measures such as targets. They try to make the policy-making process much more centralised. These three changes, I argue, of course, have not been entirely without positive results. There's no doubt that, for example, opening up the policy process can have certain advantages. But I argue that cumulatively, the effect of these three changes has been to make the centre of government less functional and therefore a less effective partner, particularly of local government, in trying to make the localist project succeed. I would just say very quickly that I think that these changes have been fundamentally driven by two processes. One is hyper-politicisation and the other is hyper-innovation. And I'm drawing here to an extent on the work of the late Mick Moran, the political scientist, of course, Professor Mick Moran from Manchester University, who's talked about these concepts in his groundbreaking book on the British regulatory state. By hyper-politicisation, we mean a governing and policy process which is much more driven by the imperatives of winning elections and short-term political objectives. And by hyper-innovation, we mean a tendency of the state to intervene, interfere, micromanage, and also engage in much greater institutional upheaval, constantly reforming and changing organisations, a relentless pace of reform. And of course, hyper-politicisation and hyper-innovation are closely linked. If the policy-making process is becoming more short-term as a consequence of the pursuit of certain electoral and political imperatives, and if actors are therefore focused on short-term initiatives, announcements, speeches, presenting policies in a favourable way, then of course this makes the entire policy process much more short-termist. And the consequence of that is that the time that is required to reform complex organisations, public services, taking the time to engage citizens in the policy process, this is likely to be neglected in such a system. And I argue that the dysfunctional character of Whitehall and the centre of government in the UK has been substantially created by this shift towards hyper-politicisation and hyper-innovation in the system of government. So just to summarise, the dysfunctional centre in Whitehall is characterised by a policy-making environment which in many ways is chaotic, toxic and anarchic. This is exacerbated by the tendency to think in terms of electoral cycles and to engage in short-term political firefighting. It also denudes the capacity which is essential for any well-functioning system of government for policy learning. And many of the policy lessons about the ineffectiveness of top-down policy change have simply not been learnt in Whitehall. As a consequence, also, there has been a proliferation of policy fiascos, policy failures and policy blunders. We may talk about some of those in the discussion afterwards. But my key point in all of this is that the consequence of a more dysfunctional centre is that the conditions which are required for an effective localism, for a localism which is able to develop successfully, are simply not in place as a consequence of this dysfunctional centre. Let me just turn to talk briefly about some of the ways in which the dysfunctional centre specifically undermines localism. Well, the first and in many ways most obvious point is that the dysfunctional centre leads to constant changes of policy direction, which themselves directly undermine local centre relations. Some of these changes in policy direction, of course, coincide with changes of government. The 2010 election, for example, is seen as a decisive break. And in many ways, it's understandable that new governments will want to take a new policy direction. However, this tendency, which is particularly endemic within the UK English system, of discarding previous policy initiatives and refusing to learn the lessons has been very costly. There were two particularly important initiatives that were, of course, developed in the final years of the Labour governments. One was the Lyons Review, which tried to establish a more coherent view of the relationship between the centre and the local level in the governance of England. And the other was the Total Place Initiative, which was an attempt to rethink the distribution of public spending in localities and to try to bring together and integrate spending pots more effectively. Both of these initiatives, of course, produced important and valuable lessons. And the problem with the system of government that we have in the UK and England is that these lessons are simply not learned. And this notion of a decisive break every time there's an election is costly in terms of good policy making. It's also the case that even where the same party remains in government, there are chaotic changes of policy direction. If we spend just a moment thinking about what has happened to devolution policy over the last decade, it has at many stages looked somewhat chaotic, at least from the outside. There have been many changes of direction. Are mayors fundamental to devolution or not? Is devolution just about cities, or should counties also be included? What powers should be captured within the process of devolution, particularly to city, region combined authorities? There have been so many changes in direction in relation to these policies that it's almost impossible to get a coherent view at all of how devolution in the English context has evolved over the recent period. And I attribute this, at least in part, to the dysfunctional nature of the centre of government. A second point which flows from the first is that this dysfunctional centre is characterised in part by a tendency to continuously dismantle and reinvent institutions. And here, I thought one of the most appropriate examples was the shift from the regional development agencies, which were of course abolished in 2010, to the creation of local economic partnerships. Now, of course, there may be a rationale for such a change, but it is the case that in the previous decade, regional development agencies had been established as reasonably effective sub-regional economic actors. And a decision was taken in 2010 to dismantle them. We now, of course, have had a network of LEPs in place for a number of years. And as many of you will be aware, there is speculation that the LEPs themselves are about to be dismantled. The real lesson here is that building institutions, building effective institutions, takes time. And where there is this continued tendency, partly attributed to what I described earlier as hyper-innovation, to constantly dismantle and reinvent institutions. We don't allow those institutions to bed in. And of course, that has further damaging consequences for the localist project. Third point about the dysfunctional centre is the particular way in which it has engaged in the reform of public services through marketisation, which has in itself further reinforced centralisation. So just as there is a commitment to try to strengthen localism, there are contradictory forces which actually end up strengthening centralisation. And some of those forces are to do with the particular way in which the reform and marketisation of public services in England has been carried out over the last 10 to 20 years. The effects of targets of particular forms of performance management, the use of quasi-markets in public services, these have all had centralising effects which undermine the very localist project that governments proclaim they are committed to. A fourth point about the dysfunctional centre is its abject refusal to address the situation, the very difficult situation that faces local government finance. There is no consideration of the need for financial autonomy. In terms of budgeting, we've had this shift from kind of heavy injections of spending into local authorities in the 2000s towards a situation where there has been unparalleled austerity and cuts in local government budgets. And this makes it very difficult for councils to act strategically. Another point, of course, is that in particular, the current government is pursuing an approach to funding where it expects local government to bid for lots of individual funding pots competitively. And this, of course, has a very damaging impact on local councils who have to use valuable resources, time, staff capacity to constantly submit new rounds of funding bids. This is not a strategic way to organise local government finance. Fifth point, the policies that have been designated as strengthening localism have so often lacked intellectual rigour. The 2011 Act is a case study of this because the legislation has in many ways failed to meet expectations precisely because it refuses to address inherent tensions in the localist agenda. And this is then reflected in the weakness of its measures and the failure, really, of implementation around the 2011 Act. There may be more to be said about that in discussion. Sixth point is that the dysfunctional centre means that local authority leaders are constantly having to struggle to make sense of policies that have been produced and manufactured in departmental silos. The way in which Whitehall works, the tendency towards silo-based policy thinking, means that it's often incumbent on local authorities to try to make sense of initiatives that have been forged without any thought as to how they integrate with the policies of other departments. This is a challenge that local authorities have so often faced. A few other points just to mention. 7, the centre has a lamentable track record on major projects. Its capacity for project management has been historically weak. And of course, this makes it harder for authorities to work with central government, particularly around infrastructure projects. I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that in many ways, the power-hoarding centralist mentality of local government reflects a position of weakness rather than strength. And of course, one of the other manifestations of the dysfunctional centre is the way in which this power-hoarding mentality constantly reasserts itself. The long-standing mistrust of local authorities that is in many ways projected by the Treasury, the fact that successive governments have tried to impose structural change on local government, the resortion to the use of anonymous unelected local bodies as a way of getting around the need to involve local councils are all manifestations of this tendency. And of course, as many in the audience will know, the 2011 Localism Act actually imposes an astonishing number of new duties and regulations on local government, despite manifestly claiming to be a legislation which is about strengthening localism. And then of course, there is also important work. I'm referring here to the work of Janice Morfitt, among others, which highlights the way in which, particularly since Brexit, there have been successive attempts to try to re-centralise power in Whitehall. And we see this in particular areas of public policy, agriculture, the environment, and transport. And then my last point here on the dysfunctional centre and how it undermines localism is that Whitehall, at least in many departments and agencies, really lacks an effective understanding of how to carry out effective policy implementation. This has been a long-standing weakness of Whitehall departments, but it's certainly got worse, I think, in the last 10 or 20 years. And this manifests itself in many ways, one of which is that the involvement of local government in new policy initiatives is so often an afterthought rather than something which is structured into the policy making process. Okay, just to touch on a couple of other points, it would be remiss of me not to mention in more detail the spending situation. I'm not going to go into much detail here because I don't have so much time, but of course the situation as regards local government finance in England is very serious, and I've mentioned this point already. The Dysfunctional Centre has presided over an unprecedented period of spending cuts. Ironically, of course, the changes in local government finance have actually made local authorities even more dependent on the centre. The other point to make here is that the funding cuts have fallen disproportionately on those authorities that face the greatest pressures and the highest levels of deprivation. And there's also the point that a growing share of local government budgets have to be devoted to certain statutory services, of which the main example is social care. So the spending situation continues to be very serious. Another manifestation of the Dysfunctional Centre is its complete refusal to address the institutional constraints that still pertain to local government. In many ways, the Dysfunctional Centre welcomes the fact that local authorities struggle to effectively resist initiatives from central government. There is in the English system still a lack of access to central government. Contact with ministers often relies on personal contacts. There is, of course, a lack of constitutional protection. Unlike other major Western European countries like France and Germany, local government in England enjoys no formal constitutional protection. And the Local Government Association, which in many ways tries its best to represent the interests of local authorities, struggles to provide an effective voice because of the diversity within local authorities, the role of party politics, what it does to undermine collective interests. My argument here is simply to say that the institutional constraints that local government has historically faced are, of course, in many ways encouraged and exacerbated by this dysfunctional centre, which wishes to keep local government in as compliant a position as possible. Okay, so I want to move on now and really focus the rest of my remarks on the reform agenda. What could be done, what should be done to try to address this dysfunctional system of government? And here what I want to do is argue, rather than simply focusing reforms on the centre of government in Whitehall, we need to think about how the whole of the system of government in England is operating. We need, in other words, a system which takes account of the need to change the centre of government, but also to better integrate local government. And that's the way that I try to approach sketching out at least the beginnings of what a reform agenda might look like in this lecture. The objective, I think, of this reform agenda has to be to strengthen the institutional capacity of government, whether it's exercised nationally or locally. And it has to be also to try to revitalise the public service bargain in England, which has been undermined by so many of the changes that I referred to earlier in the lecture. The aim here, though, is to try to ensure that local and central government is able to collaborate more effectively in order to solve complex policy problems. That's the outcome that we want to produce if we want to deliver better outcomes for citizens. We need to increase the ability of all levels of government to deal with the most complex policy problems that our societies and communities face, whether those problems are to do with the environment, whether they're to do with rising levels of crime, whether they're to do with the economy and the need to ensure higher levels of economic well-being, whether they're to deal with the crisis in health, which of course has been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. The point here is that we need a policy-making process that's capable of dealing with these policy problems, but this requires coherent action from actors at different spatial levels. And for this to work, the centre has to be a much more effective partner, both of devolved national and local governments. And as I've argued throughout this lecture, one of the reasons why the dysfunctional centre has undermined localism is because it is not capable of acting as an effective strategic partner to the local level. The way that I've thought about this question is to consider what are the qualities that we want different levels of governance in England to be able to exhibit and to embed. What kind of qualities do we want from the system of governance? And here I want to emphasize in particular three themes. One is the importance of horizontal governance, so much more effective coordination across different agencies and levels of government. Second is the importance of what I call anticipatory government. In other words, a much greater capacity for prevention of policy problems upstream, trying to reduce the effect of crises which require many more resources because problems have not been prevented earlier. And then third, intelligent governance, by which I mean a much greater capacity for intelligent sharing across these tiers of government, much greater capacity for collaboration and for joint working. Just to elaborate these points in a little bit more detail, horizontal governance is about trying to tackle the coordination deficit that characterises English governance so much. And of course, that means trying to focus governance much more on outcomes rather than targets. There's a lot of literature on this, but we need to devise practical ways in which this can be done. Integrating central policy initiatives much more effectively with the local level through collaboration and proper consultation, and also thinking about the scope for a unified public service career structure. One way to achieve much more horizontal governance would be to break down the boundaries that currently exist between careers in the Whitehall civil service and careers in local government. We need a much more coherent, unified public service career structure. My second theme is about the importance of intelligent governance. And here what I'm discussing is the need to address failure of the policy-making process, the fact that we have poorly designed policy-making and delivery structures, to quote from the work of Ivor Crew in his work on policy blunders. We need to strengthen the capacity for data and intelligence sharing across different tiers of government to deal with this problem of poor problem-solving capacity. We also need to curb the deliberation deficit in government. Again, this is a point that comes from the work of Crew and King in their now famous study of policy blunders. They argue that policy blunders and policy failure occurs more regularly because of a lack of deliberation within the system of government. One of the effects of the changes I described earlier in terms of a more compliant civil service which is subservient to politicians is that there is not enough challenge in the policy-making system. Well, one way of getting greater challenge is to much more effectively integrate local government actors within the policy-making process. We need actors at the local level to be able to challenge the thinking of central policymakers, be they civil servants or politicians. The final theme then is about anticipatory governance, strengthening the capacity for prevention. In many ways, what austerity has done is to exacerbate the pattern of spending on crises rather than preventing problems from occurring at the outset. We have to change the way that the institutions of government work to much more emphasize the importance of prevention. One way to do this would be to think about, again, the role of the Treasury, to rethink how the Treasury operates and to consider the ways in which we might incentivize better upstream spending and also the importance of early intervention. My point here is that in terms of strengthening prevention capacity and making governance more anticipatory, local government has a critical role to play, and we need to much more effectively integrate central and local government in trying to develop and advance these kinds of practices. Okay, I'm coming towards the end of the lecture, but in describing this reform agenda, it would be remiss of me not to make some additional points about necessary reforms if we are to develop a much more viable form of English localism than what we've seen over the last decade. In doing that, we cannot ignore these fundamental questions about finance and also about the constitutional status of local government in England. The first point to make is, of course, there will be no credible localism in England without proper fiscal devolution. And here there is a need for radical rethinking. The idea of a local income tax, of course, has been long debated and discussed, and it has been proposed by some political parties at general elections over the last 25 years. Do we need to return to the debate about what a local income tax might look like? And if a local income tax is not the answer, is there a way of trying to decentralize tax raising powers in order to make fiscal devolution into something credible? Second, is there a need to reform the House of Lords in order to allow local government to have much more formalized representation within our system of government and our political system? There is a question about the legitimacy of the House of Lords as it's presently configured. One way to address this would be to give the House of Lords a much more, or to give local government a more substantive role within the House of Lords. And thirdly, And a further reform, which could be additional to or in place of reform of the House of Lords, would be to try to embed a constitution in our system of government and our constitution that would oversee and protect principles of localism. And this could be overseen by a joint committee of the Houses of Parliament in order to make sure that the principles are properly enforced. This could have several beneficial effects. One is that it would formalise the status of local government. The other is that it might help to avoid some of the problems that I've been discussing in this lecture around rapid changes of policy direction, a chaotic sense that policy is not following a clear path but is constantly changing, the twists and turns of policy, which have made devolution into such a problematic project in many ways. Could this be overcome by embedding these principles within our system of government and within our constitution? These, you'll be pleased to know, are not necessarily definitive proposals, but they're questions, ideas that I want to put out there for debate, and I would love to hear the audience's views on them. They may have better alternatives. It would be great to discuss them. So let me just conclude with a few remarks to try to draw together the strands of what I've been arguing throughout this lecture. The first is that, in my judgment, one of the most important explanations for the stifling of localism in England in recent decades has been the barrage of legislative and policy changes which have been initiated by a dysfunctional centre of government, driven by imperatives around hyper-innovation and hyper-politicisation. These developments have made the policy-making process so much more chaotic, so much more dysfunctional, and this has had very negative consequences for the viability of an English localist project. Only by addressing these structural weaknesses within the policy-making process and the relationship between the central and the local level will it be possible for us to create any meaningful form of localism in England in the foreseeable future. The second point, though, is that perhaps having tried to strike a more optimistic note about the potential for serious reform, it would be remiss of me not to note that the current government does not appear to be moving in a direction that's necessarily particularly positive in terms of advancing a localist agenda. I've mentioned already the re-centralisation of powers that has taken place since Brexit. And the initial signals that are coming from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government under its new Secretary of State, Michael Gove, are not particularly promising. We've seen in the last few days proposals to create a new levelling up quango that would be run centrally through the ministry to oversee the distribution of levelling up resources across England. This seems to be a return to a centralised approach, relying on ad hoc quangos to manage these processes, not giving sufficient power to the local level. This is a negative development. It's also notable that in a speech by Neil O'Brien, the junior minister in the ministry earlier in November, Neil O'Brien talked about effectively reintroducing a system of earned autonomy back into the oversight of English local government. He wanted to return to a system which relied more on targets and on giving local authorities flexibilities and freedoms only in return for their meeting centrally prescribed criteria of performance. This in many ways is a return to an agenda which 20 years ago was exposed as not particularly effective and not working. And it's a return to a position which in many ways is likely to undermine the prospects for English localism in the future. As I've tried to emphasise, though, in this lecture, I don't think that addressing the situation can simply be about reforming Whitehall and the centre of government, crucial though that is. We have to think about the ecology of the whole of the system of government, how the centre and the local level work together effectively, how they can more effectively combat major complex policy problems, how they can work together to try to strengthen citizen engagement in the policy making process. My key point, and I'll finish with this, is that English localism will not achieve its potential without fundamental changes to how the structures and culture of central government operate. We do need better integration between the local and the centre. We do need to address the qualities of governance at all levels of government. But we also do need to address the need for fundamental change in how Whitehall and central government operates. Unless we can address the root causes of the dysfunctional centre, in my view, it will be very difficult to make further progress on English localism. And I would say, in addition, that different stakeholders, actors, organisations in the local government space have a crucial role to play in this conversation. In many respects, quite understandably, local government has been encouraged to devote its attention to the question of how to develop and advance new forms of devolution, local empowerment, and so on. And of course, it's vital that local government engages in this conversation. But local government should also, and local organisations, should have a voice in this debate about how we reform and improve the quality of central government in Whitehall. And there are many players in local government who have very important things to say about this question based on their experience of governing locally, which could improve the quality of how we govern in central government and in Whitehall. So that's all I want to say in my opening remarks. I hope that I've set out for you at least a clear position in terms of my argument. As I said, I'd love to hear your ideas and thoughts about the ways in which we can work together to improve how our system of government operates. In some ways, I've painted in this lecture a negative picture of how the centre of government works, the increasingly dysfunctional nature of Whitehall. But I don't want to set a negative tone. I want to think about the ways in which we can reform governance in order to improve outcomes for all of our citizens and our communities. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for what there was like an absolutely fantastic lecture, and your analysis was absolutely spot on. It certainly gave me a lot of food for thought. We have quite a few questions in the chat, so if that's okay, I will just start to take a few from there. Just a note to colleagues who are online, please, you might see, you may have seen that on the top right of the screen where you're watching, there is a little tab that says chat. If you want to put your questions in, just please click on that tab, and you'll be able to contribute your questions. I'll start off, Patrick, with a question from Professor Robin Hambleton from the University of the West of England. Robin, first of all, says that he really enjoyed the lecture, and is making a point that is a very interesting one. So he's basically saying, in 1996, Sir Patrick Charles Carter, when writing up a major JRF program of research on local central relations, concluded that local authorities needed the freedom to do things differently. So his question essentially is, do you agree with that, with Sir Charles, and do you favor the creation of a constitutional convention to address the imbalances in power that have been identified?
Well, thanks so much to Robin for a great question, or two questions really that are embedded in that larger question. I think on this question about local authorities having the freedom to do things differently, of course, I agree with that proposition. I think that what I would add in terms of the ideas I was sketching out in the lecture, though, is that you want that local innovation, that embrace of diversity, the capacity for local experimentation to also operate within a system so that other localities can learn the lessons of what's been done in particular places. So I think part of creating this more collaborative policymaking system is exactly that. You can, as Robin says, encourage much more local diversity and experimentation, having the freedom to undertake different initiatives and programs that are appropriate to the local level, but then share and pool the evidence and the outcomes and the evaluation that you get from those experiments so that there can be more learning across different localities, which I think in many ways our policymaking system in England still lacks. On the question of a constitutional convention, of course, I wouldn't be averse to that at all. In many ways, what I've been proposing here in the lecture is a couple of potential initiatives that could be put in place to try to deal with the institutional weakness that local government faces in our current system of government. But it would, I think, in key respects, be perhaps more coherent to think about the role of local government within the shape of the overall constitution. And of course, a way to do that would be through a constitutional convention that considers the relationship between all of the tiers of government, the relationship between government and citizens. So yes, absolutely, I think a constitutional convention could be a very appropriate way of taking these issues forward.
Thanks very much, Patrick. We have another question from Paul O'Brien, the Chief Executive of APSI. Paul is asking, does the lack of coherence in the messy structure and system of English local government hinder the advance of localism alongside local governments' underfunding and limitations in power and resources?
I think my answer to Paul's question is yes, but let me try to elaborate a bit more why I say that. I think that there's been a debate among policymakers, and it was certainly the case when I was working in Whitehall, what seems like now a very long time ago, but was over a decade ago, about the shape of the localist project. And I think this question in particular about how coherent should it be? Should we try to have a roadmap that we apply across the whole territory equally? Does there need to be some uniformity? And I've always been persuaded by the view that to pursue absolute uniformity in terms of the localist settlement is misguided, because you do need to give some scope for local areas, local communities to decide the appropriate structures by which they're governed. I think the lesson of previous local government reorganisations, particularly those that took place in the early 1970s, is they tended to ride roughshod over the views of local communities, and this of course undermines legitimacy in the government system. But we do need, I think, to strike a better balance. You can strike, I think, a more effective balance between coherence and the need for local diversity. And I think that the way that devolution has been pursued over the past decade, there's been too much emphasis on allowing a somewhat messy, chaotic system to evolve, and not enough emphasis, as I argued in the lecture, on trying to establish some intellectually coherent principles of localism that face up to the very real trade-offs that are involved in any localist project. I think that's been too often absent, not just, it must be said, from the current governing Conservative Party, but also to a large extent from the Labour Party as well. And of course, as Paul says in his question, some of those reforms were too top-down. And although there was, in the 2000s, a fairly significant increase in funding for local government, it was not part of a more long-term settlement that could really address the historic crisis that local government now faces in terms of its finances. Labour also, as we know, ducked the question of how to reform local government finance. So I don't think this is just a problem of the last decade. I think it's been brewing for some time, but it certainly requires resolution, I think, now.
Absolutely. There is actually another question on, the issue of funding, which of course is a very pressing one. It's from Joe, and Joe is asking, how would one manage the challenges of inequality in fiscal devolution? Poor areas also tend to have the highest needs, which could lead to further embedding of inequality.
Yes, I mean, obviously this is a crucial question that Joe poses in terms of how to put in place a sustainable system of local government finance that also addresses the need for equality between areas, particularly areas that have less capacity to raise taxation. I think there are examples around the world, though, of where this has been done. There are plenty of cases of where countries have been able to evolve local taxation systems with redistributive mechanisms that ensure that deprived areas where there are higher levels of inequality can have compensatory funding to ensure that they are not disadvantaged by a local income tax system that will, of course, inherently benefit the most affluent areas with the highest household incomes. So I think it can be done with some imagination, also some policy learning from other countries. Of course, there is a tension involved here, and I talked in the lecture about facing up to some of these tensions. But in my judgment, you're never going to, in England, see a viable localist project without addressing the question of the decentralisation of funding powers. And of course, that may involve at times some difficult choices. You do have to think, as I say, very hard about the compensating mechanisms that can ensure that some communities don't suffer because of the way in which you now raise funding through local income tax, for example. But I think it can be done. As I say, I think there's lots of policy lessons that point in that direction from around the world. If we learn those lessons, and I think such a system could be put in place with mechanisms that would prevent poorer communities from suffering.
Thanks very much, Patrick. We have a question from Mo Baines. Mo is also from APSI. Mo here is reflecting on some of the findings of the APSI Local Government Commission 2030 report. And she is saying the Localism Act embedded centralisation by enshrining over 120 reserve powers to the Secretary of State, reducing the ability of local authorities to determine local services. So it was anti-localist in effect. How do we therefore address this constant legislative interference?
Well, that's an excellent question that Mo poses. I mean, I have to say, drawing on research that I've looked at, including from the Birmingham University, I think they count 147 centralising regulations and statutes in the 2011 Localism Act. So how they ever got away with calling it a Localism Act is a story of its own, because it imposes so many re-centralising measures, as applies in that question. You know, how does one now address this? Well, clearly there's a need to revisit the whole way in which the localism project has been pursued. I think that in terms of this question about where does this instinct to re-centralise come from, I talked in the lecture about the power-hoarding centralist tendency within Whitehall, and I think in many ways we see manifestations of it constantly. It's been very difficult to curb that centralising tendency. As I tried to discuss in the lecture, I think in many ways, though, this power-hoarding mentality reflects the position of weakness that many parts of Whitehall now find themselves in. I think there is something of a crisis of purpose in some Whitehall departments. What are those departments trying to achieve today? What's their role? In an era when many operational responsibilities have shifted to agencies, there's a big question about what government departments are in fact trying to achieve. And of course, this question has been exacerbated by some of the developments I talked about in the lecture, the marginalisation or displacement of civil servants from the policy-making process, and the ways in which certainly some civil servants have tried to compensate for this by exercising these centralist tendencies, trying all the time to push back against any form of localism and trying to regain power for the centre. So I think addressing this, which is Mo's question, you know, does require fundamental reform of how the centre of government works. As I again tried to discuss in the lecture, I think central government plays a very important role in our system of government. I'm not in that sense a localist who argues that somehow central government doesn't matter. Having a strategic, capable centre of government is absolutely vital. But in my view, if it is strategic and capable and it has good policy-making capacities, then it should not exhibit these constant centralist power-hoarding tendencies. So, as I say, it is about reforming Whitehall, giving Whitehall a renewed sense of purpose, giving departments a core sense of what they're trying to achieve. I think if we can re-establish that in Whitehall, that will at least do something to curb these re-centralising tendencies. I should also say that, of course, one of the reasons why I do support a measure that would involve, for example, constitutional clarification of some principles of localism, because you also need some protections for local government against these centralist tendencies. However effective reform Whitehall, there will always be politicians and civil servants whose appetite for centralism is very difficult to control. And so I think having constitutional protections, again, as further safeguards, would be an additional way of addressing the problem alludes to in the question.
Very good points there, Patrick. We have another question from Peter Eckersley, Nottingham Trent University, and also editor of Local Government Studies. First of all, Peter is saying great lecture, and he's interested in knowing your thoughts as to how austerity has exacerbated these functions in central government. So Peter is asking, have cuts in civil service policy function meant less understanding of local government?
Well, it's a great question again. Thanks to Peter. I think it's absolutely right that austerity and reducing the administrative capacity of central government has meant that there is less understanding of the role of local government among policymakers in Whitehall. Again, I think if we look at evidence around COVID, it's very apparent that in some key government departments, as the COVID crisis began, there was just far too little understanding of the role that local authorities play, the functions that local government performs. And I think this is the consequence of several developments. I mean, one is simply cuts in policy-making capacity in the civil service. I think the other is a tendency to have much greater churn in the civil service, a loss also of institutional memory. One of the other, I think, key changes in terms of civil service careers has been the tendency to lose many more senior civil servants at points in their careers when we would have expected them previously to stay in their positions in Whitehall. Now, of course, I mean, I'm not in favour of a lifetime civil service where everyone stays in their position throughout their working career. But I think that these changes have weakened institutional memory in Whitehall. which contributes to this problem that Peter alludes to, of a lack of really deep understanding of what local government, local authorities are doing. And I think there's also a broader question, again, for Whitehall and for the central government civil service about what kinds of capabilities is it seeking in those it recruits and employs to do policy making, operational and delivery roles. Because you definitely want people in those roles who understand the importance of collaboration, who do know something about local government, who can work across the central local boundary. You need to encourage these kinds of qualities. And I think that also means reforms of how we recruit, attract and retain civil servants. This seems to me to be a really important question for those who are currently running the Whitehall civil service.
Thanks very much. We are coming towards the close of the Q&A session, but there is one question that brings us to a level of government that we've not discussed so far, and so it might be nice to close with that. What about town and parish councils then? James Deronian is asking, why haven't successive UK governments meaningfully enabled 10,000 plus ultra-local councils, which have existed for a very long time and represented the lowest tier of local government, to take a role in localism? That's a very good point, actually, and probably a nice way also to round up the discussion.
Yeah, well, it's an excellent point that James makes, and I would just offer a couple of reflections. I think in terms of the question of why there has not been much focus in thinking in the context of localism about town councils and parish councils is partly that, of course, the devolution project, particularly over the last decade, has been very much treasury driven, and it's been driven by this imperative of devolving certain amounts of powers and resources to city, region, combined authorities. So it's been about a certain scale of devolution. And, you know, as I was arguing in the lecture, I think one of the difficulties in this is that, you know, this has not confronted the consequence of this form of devolution for the governance settlement of England. It's left many places feeling marginalised or forgotten about because they don't conform to the kind of scale devolution project that the Treasury is interested in. I think going back to the period of the Labour government after the 2001 election, there was an attempt by some ministers to try to think more creatively about the need for a new localism. And of course, in 2006, actually after the 2005 election, David Miliband, who was then the Secretary of State at the Department for Communities and Local Government, discussed and talked about this idea of double devolution, which was to signify that you could have devolution to a city government level, but you could also devolve below that to parishes and to town councils. In other words, to neighbourhood governance units, which can much more effectively work with local communities. And I have to say, and I'll finish on this point, I mean, I've talked a lot tonight from perhaps a perspective as an academic, but as Ariana said in the introduction, I was for 4 years a councillor in the London Borough of Southwark. And what I learned really from that experience was the value that local people place on local services and the functions that their local council fulfills, but also the importance of forms of support and government which are able to deal with the issues that people face in their local neighbourhoods, very local problems, how to improve the quality of green spaces, how to make streets cleaner, in more deprived communities, how to deal with problems around sometimes the growth of or the rise of antisocial behaviour, problems around how to improve the quality of public amenities, you know, very local problems. And so, you know, I agree that you need a form of devolution, a form of localism that definitely does provide greater powers for the very local neighbourhood level, rather than just seeing devolution, as I think has been the case over the last decade, as a scale project, which is just about devolution to the combined authority level. You definitely need devolution pressure below that, and I think that has to be part of any English localist project for the future.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And this is a very good point to close on. And from my point of view, I think I've always had issues with the concept of double devolution, because for me, it really exposes the problem, which is, well, subsidiarity, if the government really embraced the concept of subsidiarity, then we wouldn't need to talk about double devolution, because it would mean having powers going down to the very local level. But we will leave that for another lecture then, or another discussion. For the time being, just let me say thank you for a fantastic lecture. It's been really an honor to have you, and thanks for really a great analysis on this very important issue. As you will have seen from the quality and quantity of the questions, the audience have been very engaged, and so it's not just me saying that, but it's been certainly, your contribution has been certainly very well received. So thank you very much, Patrick. It has been really an honor to have you with us. I will just conclude with a couple of notes about future events from the Local Governance Research Centre. This is the annual lecture, and after this we will start with a series of seminars. The next one will be early in January. We will look at socially responsible procurement in Barcelona. So we will move to a different country, and we will have Yunelis Salazar from the Autonomous University of Barcelona delivering a seminar on that. If you are on the LGRC mailing list, you will receive all the information about the seminar, and we look forward to seeing you there. For the time being, thanks once again to Patrick for a fantastic lecture, and thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us and for your fantastic questions and the good discussion. Thank you very much, and good evening.